I'm very excited that Pastor Stephen Evans is here. He's the reason why I can call myself not just a Presbyterian, but an AMEer.
That's right.
Is that how you would say that? An AMEer?
You're AME. That's just.
I am AME.
That's right.
I'm AME. And Stephen is from Greenville. So what is that? Greenvillian?
That's right.
He's a native Greenvillian.
That's right.
So we were comparing notes yesterday, preparing for today, and he was telling me some stories about his years growing up, and I'm sure he'll share that with you. I'm only going to talk 15 minutes. I've got the clock right in front of me. I'm really going to try to stick to that because I want to give Stephen time, and I also want this to be a time of discussion, about 15 to 20 minutes. So I'm hopeful that we'll be done this on the hour, and then we'll have some time for your questions and have a conversation. So while we're talking, we're going to depend on your input and thoughts. So be keeping that in mind. And what I want to talk about is being awake, or in the language of my college students, being woke, right? And I grew up in the North, so Philadelphia, Ohio. I spent a little bit of time in the Midwest, in Oklahoma, but for me it was a change moving to the South. In the North, we like to think that we're not racist, and it's pretty evident that we are. If you look at the history of the United States, especially after World War II, you don't have outright segregation in the North, but what you have is a mass migration from the inner city to the suburbs. And so it's a different kind of segregation, but it's segregation nonetheless. And for me, in my journey of being awake as I am, it started when I graduated from college, and I worked as a computer consultant for 2 years, and then I quit that job and I worked in the inner city in North Philadelphia with an organization called Kingdom Works, run by Bart Campolo. Now, if you know who Tony Campolo is, Bart Campolo is Tony Campolo's son. And Bart was doing ministry in Philadelphia. Tony was doing ministry in Trenton. And in North Philly, I was with a bunch of college students. We had a camp. And the first day we moved into a church in the neighborhood, we walked the neighborhood. And this one kid said to his mother, "Look, Mommy, it's the people from TV." So he had never seen a white person except for on television. And, he could have gotten on a bus and ridden a mile outside of that neighborhood and run into somebody. So who was not black. But his whole life had been in this neighborhood where, this was in the early 90s, so you had the crack epidemic. You had big potholes in the streets. There were video stores. Remember video stores? I could not get a video in this neighborhood. You had to show like 3 different forms of identification, right? Not just your driver's license, like your birth certificate. You had to put a $100 deposit down. There was no trust. And there was a lot of brokenness. And I spent a year in the city. I spent a summer in that neighborhood, and then I was in West Philadelphia. But I kept going back to that neighborhood after the summer was over, and I would meet with a kid, and I would take him downtown, and we would go to different stores. And I remember it was Christmas time, and we were at Wanamaker's, and Wanamaker's had a big Christmas tree that had Christmas tree lights that would change, and there was a pattern. It was like, red, and then yellow, and then green, and then blue, and then it would repeat. And so I was guessing, what was next, and he was guessing what was next. And after about a minute of this, he turns to me and he says, if I say white, white, do you think I'll become white? And I was just so taken back by that idea that he wanted to be a different skin color than he was. And it seemed incredibly sad to me. But I trying to think of it from his point of view, this was like a whole world of everything was there and everything was orderly and everything worked, and this was the white world that he wanted to be a part of, and he didn't feel a part of it, and that's why he wanted to change his skin color. So that really made me start thinking about what the heck am I doing in my ministry, and I need to try to understand what's going on in the thought world of the folks that I was ministering to at the time. Flash forward to when we moved to South Carolina, and when we moved to Clinton, I immediately felt a little uncomfortable. There was a monument commemorating, and still is a monument commemorating the Civil War and those who fell during the Civil War in the middle of town. And coming from the north, I thought, okay, gosh, I don't really even think about the Civil War anymore, And here I am in the South, and I'm reminded of this war that I suppose I was on the other side of, right? But it's still alive. This memory is still alive. And in the cemetery of the church that we go to, First Presbyterian Church, there were Confederate flags next to some graves in commemoration of that war that made us also feel a little bit uncomfortable. When we started to foster Isaiah, we got the call the Thursday before Confederate Memorial Day. And we got this frantic call. Trish was the one that got the call, and then she called me. And DSS, the Department of Social Services, said, we need you to make a decision. We have this boy. He needs a home. And tomorrow is a state holiday. And, Trish was like, what state holiday is that? Confederate Memorial Day. And, one of the women that was telling her this was African American and was a little bit embarrassed that, that was still celebrated. And so immediately, as we're thinking about fostering this biracial child, this history is brought up. This history of slavery, this history of racism that has to be dealt with in some way. Also, when my wife was having a conversation with our church has a preschool ministry, which is fairly open to the public. A lot of the folks from the church have their kids go to that preschool. Our other two kids went to that preschool, and we wanted to put Isaiah in that preschool. And when we inquired about it, they said, we don't take DSS kids. And started talking about there's all these regulations that you have to follow, and we don't want to have to follow all those regulations. And Trish was just telling me, because I was trying to remember all the details of this, she had a conversation with somebody in our church who said, well, we don't want our kids hanging out with those kids, right? And I was like, I'm ashamed. I'm ashamed that that's the attitude that our church the position our church takes. And also the fact came up about Confederate Memorial Day, and she said, it's really sad our preschool kids used to go out and place the flags in the cemetery, and we don't do that anymore. And my wife said, I'm glad that they don't do that, because that makes me a little uncomfortable. She's a lot more forthright than I am. I would just be keeping my thoughts to myself, but she's just going to say it. And this woman said, well, we don't mean it in a racist way. We're just trying to remember those people who lost their lives in this war. And she went on to say, well, we're a rich white church, with a reputation for not being very welcoming. And this just doesn't look very welcoming when we have the Confederate flags in our cemetery. Now, our church doesn't do that anymore, but kids in our Sunday school class, our high school Sunday school class, still remember that was something that the church used to do, and some of them still feel like the church should still do it. And I think we need more diversity in our church. I think in order to be awake to how other people might see something that we might intend one way, but it's perceived another way, we need to be a diverse community in order for that to happen. So I'm going to tie this in with the adoption theme here, that when you're looking to adopt or foster, particularly through DSS, through the state, you can't, as a family, say, I'm only going to take white kids, right? If you expand that to the idea of the church, I don't think the church, as an adoptive family, can say, we're only going to have a daycare that reaches out to biological families. That doesn't work with the foster care system. That just shouldn't be on the table. And I compare it to, I want to say, what, it was 15, 20 years ago, churches started to put in all the ramps and make churches handicapped accessible. I found out later, one of the reasons why we didn't have our DSS license was because we would have to pay money for bigger windows and enlarge our doors and so on. So there were capital expenditures that our church was not willing to pay. It was a money thing, and I see it as an access, right? If we're going to say that we are a fully accessible community, we need to pay the money that it takes to do that. I want to read a scripture passage. I know we're almost out of time. I'll keep it fairly short, and I have a lot of other things to say, but I'm just not going to say them. So in Galatians chapter 3, this is what Paul says. But now that faith has come, we are no longer subject to a disciplinarian, the law. For in Christ Jesus you are all children of God through faith. As many of you as were baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. If you dig into Galatians a little bit, you see the example of Peter. Now, of course, this is Paul's perspective. Peter doesn't have a chance to weigh in on this. But Peter he had this vision in Acts where he's supposed to eat with Gentiles, even though it's food that's considered unclean. And he makes that leap of faith, and he does that. But apparently he backslid. And so when he was among the Galatians, he would, when he was with Jews, refrain from eating with Gentiles because of the pressure that he felt that, again, he was considered unclean. So there was a segregation in that community. And the way that Paul addressed that was to say, hey, look, you don't have to become Jewish in order to become Christian. We should not have these two separate communities. This needs to be one family, right? We're all adopted. It's not like the Jews are naturally God's people and the Christians have to be adopted into this family. The Jews also were adopted. We're all adopted. So I'll end it there. Stephen.
It's going to end it there. Pass the torch. It's funny, while he was talking, I guess I'm going to kind of remix, since he's using these young people's terminology about being woke, I'm going to remix my presentation a little bit. Because just listening to Kirk and after our discussion over lunch yesterday and our previous discussions, just reflecting about, how we got to this point. We know biblically there is no such thing as chance. God is a God of order. And I truly believe that. And growing up in Greenville, I grew up not too far from here. I grew up off East North Street in the Green Line Spartanburg community. But prior to that, I lived in the projects right off Pleasantburg. But I was bused to school to Eastside. So I went to school at Mitchell Road, then I went to school at Greenville Middle, then I went to high school at Eastside. And so I was always in what, up until recent years, were a very impoverished community. But I was always bused to places that had the two-story, nice two-car garages and things like that. Their homes were always resourced with great materials, and I remember walking from East North Street after school and on Saturdays all the way to the library just so I could compete. But it made me think about, as Kirk is saying, certain things, growing up for a lot of us, things didn't seem accessible because of race. You bypass two schools to go to another school far away, and you see certain individuals, because of their socioeconomic status, get certain privileges when you did not. And I really got in trouble one time, and I'm going to share this story. My senior year at Eastside. Anybody here go to Eastside? All right. Go Eagles. That's right. Class 9. My senior year, we, for some reason, were having all these racial problems. And these were kids, that I had gone to elementary school with, middle school. We followed each other. And when we considered each other close, we had to spend the night. Well, they didn't spend the night at my house, but I spent the night at their houses, things like that. And we had camped together and played sports together. But for some reason, it's amazing how, whether it's our parents, our grandparents, what we watch on television, what we read, what we're poisoned through this environmental noise, it changes stuff. I don't think it's by coincidence that God petitions that we act as children. Have you ever seen children? They don't really care. And I don't embrace the idea that you don't see color, because I think you should. I don't want you to dismiss the fact that I'm a black man, that I'm African American, because that would discount the struggles that my parents and grandparents had to go through, and that I continue to go through. But children love each other, even if. But for some reason, by the time we got to high school, we were at odds with each other for some reason. And I remember being a student leader, and the SACS committee was coming to give us our accreditation. And I'm kind of known for being kind of very vocal. And I was not allowed initially to be a part of that group. And so I had already trained the next wave to come up. And they're like, well, Steve, are you going to be at this meeting? And I said, no, I'm not. I haven't been invited. And I guess word got back to the principal that, Steve should really be in that meeting. So after lunch, he was like, Steve, you need to go to me. I said, no, sir. I said, I'm not on the list. I'll get in trouble. I'll be deemed skipping class. I'll take care of it. So I get there, and we go into the auditorium, and it's divided, just like our lunchrooms were divided, and things. So it's blacks over to the left, whites over to the right, and all of a sudden, the group from Columbia asked what's going on, and all the white kids were talking about how they needed new cheerleading uniforms and how we needed to do new bleachers for the football, for the stadium and all this. And I hear all this noise behind me because I'm sitting in the front, and they're saying, Steve, we really have to say something because we've been having these issues. And all the way the school was trying to address it, they put together this council, and it's almost as if they gave us a 2-week window to try and reconcile stuff. But you can't solve something in 2 weeks. Can you really? If you can find a problem that you can solve in 2 weeks, see me after this so we can package that and we'll all be paid. But I raised my hand and I shared with them some concerns that we had. And these were individuals, again, that we had played kickball together, Pop Warner football together. We had been to camps together. We had, you name it, G.I. Joe, Transformers together, all this stuff. And they were angry. How dare you say this? And it wasn't just students. I had black and white teachers come and tell me, well, you need to watch out for this teacher. You need to watch out for that teacher. But that's not the worst of it. The worst of it came when I had just had a conversation with my accounting teacher. And right before class starts, there's a knock on the door. And it's one of the officials from Columbia, and he asked to speak to me. So I kind of looked at my teacher because I was like, oh, what's going on? She's like, no, go ahead. You can handle yourself. So he takes me out into the foyer, and we're talking. And he made reference and said, you know what? you should just understand that sometimes that's just the way that things happen to be. You said that to the wrong person. I said, well, that's not how I was raised. And you have to understand how my church was formed. The AME church was formed out of what in essence was a protest in a way. We had helped build additions to this church and all, and we were kneeling at the altar. And we were told that we weren't welcome to kneel at the altar. We just said, if you allow us to finish talking to God, we won't bother you anymore. And so our church grew out of that. But because we were oppressed, we never oppressed anybody else. We're very welcoming. People say, you're AME, you're African. Do y'all have white members? I said, not only do we have white members, we have white pastors. And our fastest growing church is in England. But I had to educate that state official and say, you should not tell a young person that they should accept any type of oppression. And now, as we've gone through our training as ministers, you know that that's against the word of God. God teaches us to fight oppression, and God teaches us to fight things that are unjust. And when we talk about adoption and being inclusive, when we look at the New Testament's way of adoption, even if you go into further on into Galatians, you understand that one, we know that we're brought into the family by regeneration. We're born again. But understand that through adoption, we already have full access. We're heirs to the kingdom. We're looked at as sons of God. So as sons of God, that means that we don't have to wait to receive what God has for us. But why is it that, especially when we talk about Sundays being the most segregated days of the week, and we know all the history behind that, but when we think about where we are now, as believers and as true believers, we should be in the process of trying to make sure that everybody has access to what God demands us to have. And having access to what God demands us to have, we can actually make that happen through truly something called love. I know that seems kind of, floating in the air kind of thing, some kind of Disney type of sentiment. But, somebody asked me, they said, do you think we could solve, all these problems just by love? I said, well, once everybody has a true understanding of what it means to love. I used this analogy. I said, I can't say I love my wife, who I'll be married to next year for 20 years. I can't say I love her just on Valentine's Day, but disrespect her the other 364 days. That's not love. God does not do that. God gives us new mercies every day. But why, when we've been given something that we didn't earn, we've been given all this through grace and mercy, do we not have that same benevolent spirit amongst one another? It's easy to divide. It's easy. God could have easily divided us, and he tells us that eventually he will divide those who know him and those who don't. But for those of us who are part of the household of faith, who are part of one body, we should love and take care of one another. And it's easy to say this. And Kirk, we were talking about this yesterday. I'm quick to say, again, just as much as I want you to see who I am and understand why I am AME, I respect, everybody else. But when it's all said and done, there's no black heaven, there's no white heaven, there's no AME heaven, there's no Baptist heaven. But we have a problem trying to understand that. God says that he'll know that we're his by the way that we treat one another, right? Then he also tells us that, if we love ourselves, then we can love our neighbors. Is the problem that maybe we don't love ourselves? Are we fearful of something? Are we afraid of something? But God has not given us a spirit of fear. So as we look at this adoption piece and we talk about being heirs to the kingdom, when you're a son, by adoption, you're enjoying the family. Can we say that we're truly enjoying and having life and life more abundantly? Not if we're still having to battle this whole racism issue. I mean, we're really not there. Can we really say that we have liberty and freedom and be true heirs to the Father? You can't really receive what God has for you if you're not embracing what God expects for us to do. Now, God gave us these 10 commandments, right? I even use this analogy, and we won't get into this. We spend a lot of energy on a lot of stuff, don't we? For instance, we spend a lot of energy on same-sex marriages and stuff, but guess what? It made the top 10, adultery. We don't talk about that, do we? Right? We let that slide. But adultery made the top 10, but we don't talk about that. But we spend all this other energy. But God knew, because of our sinful nature, because of our natural, desire to be rebellious, he said, you know what? I'm going to give you a new commandment. commandment, love one another as I love you. And if truly love conquers a multitude of sins, and love, God is love, as the word tells us, shouldn't that be the fundamental, that common denominator that allows us to have dialogue like we're having tonight, to be able to converse with one another? We can agree to disagree, but at least have some kind of conversation so we can figure out what we're disagreeing about. Because sometimes we don't know what we're disagreeing about. I'll give you a good example. We're poisoned by, again, stuff that people flood to us. I can go into a store that I frequent right now in Clinton, and we were just talking about this. If I'm suited up, they know it's Reverend Evans. But if I put on my New York Knicks jersey or hood and a cap, they don't know who it is, and I get treated different. That's crazy. That's crazy. That same attitude happens within the walls of our sanctuary. When folk oftentimes don't look like us, and it doesn't necessarily always have to be race. It can be socioeconomic. It can be appearance or whatever. We have a tendency to have these flags that fly up and all these things. Let me give you a good example of how God expects us to act. We all know the more recent thing that has bothered us as a denomination, as AMEs, is what happened in Charleston. And it still amazes people that we were not ready to start a riot. But we're a very organized church. I got phone calls from my colleagues here in Greenville saying, we're getting ready to go out places. They were getting ready to go to the Peace Center and protest and all this stuff. I said, I can't move. I'm waiting for direction from my leadership. And it was not until the next day that we were en route here to our flagship charge here in Greenville to have a discussion on what we should do. And it was a multicultural discussion. It was just not us. But folk expected us to be very angry. But what did we do? We forgave. And folks said, how can you? How can you? Well, we're the church, and God expects that of us. And so our tagline, for lack of better words, happened to be wrong church, wrong day. Because we should not act the way that the world acts. If you would attack somebody in the street, you would expect them to riot. But when you attack the church, we're supposed to act in the way that God expects us to do. And by us forgiving, did y'all see how God was able to move that flag that just a few months prior to myself and some other folk had prayed around? That flag came down. Folk whose forefathers had said some of the more ridiculous and some of the craziest elements of hate said, you know what? My family was wrong. Let's move on. Let's move on. God expects us to heal. Most of us migrate to church unless we've been in a situation where we were raised in the church. But folk who have not been raised in the church, they usually gravitate to the church because they're hurting, right? And the church is a place of healing. And if the church is a place of healing, we're not supposed to keep that medicine inside the walls. We're supposed to also take that medicine outside the walls. That's what the Great Commission calls us to do. So when we're adopted, we're not coming in as children. We're coming in as full adults with the full benefits, and with those benefits come great responsibility to love folk as God has loved us. I'm going to stop there and we can go back.
Yeah.
Did that help?
Great. Yeah.
Was that all right?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's good. Thanks.
Kurt's, Dr. Nolan's a Princeton guy, so I was just making sure, I'm not on that level yet. No.
I was keeping notes in my head.
Okay.
So.
All right.
Questions, comments?
And be open. Be just open. Well, while I was at Eastside, and a lot of times, I'm a firm believer that a lot of the stuff regarding race is more so socioeconomic. Let me premise that. For instance, when the police brutality thing has been there since they've had police officers here, since they've had slave catchers that, quote-unquote, caught fugitive slaves. That's always been the case. But think about the layout of a plantation. You have the master and his family in the big house. You have the overseers and you have the slaves. The overseers lived just as bad as the slaves, but they didn't understand it. They were out in they didn't work the field, but they were out in the heat too. When you looked at the 99 and the 1% that took place, when that movement was taken on, it was a multicultural movement that showed folk that really a bigger problem was economics. As soon as we started coming together and saying that it was an economic issue, we got distracted by all this other stuff that had been there all the time. Yeah, it needs to be addressed, but it was there. So using that as a framework for Eastside. Eastside, everybody knows where Eastside's at, right? Eastside lives right off Brushy Creek, you know, and beautiful edifice, beautiful community. Folk were well known, but there are a group of kids, I don't know if it was because of who their parents happened to be or whatever, but they were just given flat out privileges that other folk didn't get. Many of us were told to stay in particular parts of the school and different things, and they were able to even leave campus at times and things like that. There was a coach, I shared this with Kirk. There was a coach that started a Confederate club, and he was told by administration not to do it. And so he took money out of his own pocket and had T-shirts made up, and the next day his whole group flooded the campus with all these Confederate shirts on. So we're like, that's not happening. Something needs to change. So it became those type of situations. You couldn't challenge teachers. I was known for challenging teachers about history. I think history oftentimes is his story instead of history. And I would challenge things because I had read otherwise. And understand that a lot of times, especially when we look at race, especially here in the South lost, but they got to write the history. So a lot of stuff was kind of vexed. So it was a crazy environment, and the principal at the time just did not seem to have a clear grasp on things. Needless to say, he got demoted, and people blame me. We talk about Kaepernick sacrificing. I sacrificed scholarships and things like that, but I knew it was a bigger issue, and I knew that God would take care of me, so I was not worried about that. But that environment was very toxic, and it was a great academic institution. I was very well prepared when I left to go off to undergrad, but as far as really trying to make sure that you empowered everyone, it was not that. It was a very privileged situation. And I think when we talk about race, and even from a Christian standpoint, we need to understand that privilege is a very important thing that we need to talk about. Sometimes when you're accustomed to receiving certain things, you don't understand the whole dynamic of privilege. And even as believers, if you've always grown up in the church and no one looks at you with a side eye, you're given certain movement within the faith. But if you let somebody come in where everybody knows that either they used to be a drug addict or a drug dealer or an alcoholic, or you let somebody who just happens to be, there are a lot of black Presbyterians. So, but say if you're the only Presbyterian church and the community happens to be white, but you want to worship at a Presbyterian church and they look at you crazy, those kind of things. So we need to really look at that from the framework too, because privilege is multifaceted also. Did that help? Okay. A lot of the schools started out of churches. Actually, Bell Street started out of Friendship. So it started out of churches, and eventually you have what were deemed some of the premier historic black schools in the area. Sterling. My mom went to Bryson down in Lawrence County. Lincoln, around the Taylor's area and other places. My mom would tell this story about when they would walk to school. They did not have a bus. And when you hear the story about Clinton, that there are a group of parents that pull their money together to buy a bus to take kids to school. But two things my mom used to tell me about. One, that when they would walk to school, that the white kids on the bus would throw things out at them and yell stuff at them and spit at them. But they were determined to go to school. And I remember when my mom passed, there's an African American museum here in Greenville, and the director there gave me my mom's yearbook to just get some pictures out of, scan some pictures out of. And if you looked at those pictures, you would see that the schools were, the classes were divided of such because there were certain classes that only were able to go to school certain times because they had to go back and work the fields and things like that. But you said, you grew up and then later on you only found out that there are folk around you. You look at Clinton and many other communities, a lot of communities were divided by tracks, on railroad tracks, or even though you may have known folk lived next door, you knew not to go over there, those kind of things. Let me give you another East Side story. One of my closest friends happened to be a white Jewish guy, and he ended up going to Riverside. And one day, we make you laugh, we had this grand idea that we were going to be this best, great new rap group, and we came this close to getting the contract. But one night, we were having a sleepover at his house, and that night before, that Friday night, we had played football in the street, and that morning when we woke up, someone had egged his car, those kind of things. So, in our, you talk about integration. My older siblings helped integrate Wade Hampton, and they would tell me stories about how there are white parents that came in and had, shotguns because they were like, no, it's not going to happen. How many of y'all remember when the Parks and Recreation Department was segregated here in Greenville? Did y'all know the story behind the pool? There was a pool here in Greenville, and it was time for integration. They're like, no way. And so they threw seals in the pool, and the seals could not survive in the pool. So eventually they filled the pool with dirt and made it a garden. And then eventually from a garden, they filled it up and it became a basketball court and some other stuff. But that's crazy. That's crazy.
Stephen was telling me about the churches in Clinton. On Broad Street, there's United Methodist Church, there's the Baptist Church. The Presbyterian Church is also, prominently right along the train tracks. He said, have you ever wondered why there are no historically black churches, that you can see from any of the main thoroughfares in Clinton? Well, they weren't allowed. They weren't allowed to be along the main drag. They had to be off on side roads.
It was against the law.
Yeah. And I had never thought about that.
Yeah. That's a beautiful name. That's my wife's name.
And his friend and I were talking, and she's African American, and she's AME. And I was lamenting the whole Sunday being the most segregated day of the week. And she said, well, how would you change it? Like, would I have to come to your church? Would you come to my church?
go first? You want to go first?
I want to go first,
Go
but
first. Yeah.
is that okay?
Yeah.
All right.
I saw you chomping at the bit.
I'm like, you're laying it out there. So this is my hope, is that we think of ourselves as missionaries. And I love the experience that I'm having, that our family's having at AME Church, but we also have a lot of ties to our church. We teach Sunday school. Our kids are very involved and have friends at First P. So I don't want to give that up either. And I would love it if we had more families from First P going to Friendship AME. And I would love it if Friendship AME had people that felt a strong call to mission to worship once a month, and not have it be some formal, exchange and some committee and, so on. But just kind of organically, people that feel called to this. And I would even want to go further and say part of your tithe should go to that other church that you're worshiping at once a month. And so that you're financially invested in that congregation. And it's not, my church, First P, sending money over to Friendship AME with strings attached to it. We're worshiping at that church. We're a part of that church. Part of our tithe goes to that church. And I'm sure Mike's like shaking his head, no, that's not a good idea. And Stephen wasn't even sure that was a good idea.
Yeah,
When I brought up
like,
tithing, he was like, no, you're going to mess everything up. But because I can play a prophetic role here and I'm not a pastor, I can throw out crazy schemes like that. But I think our church in the United States is at a disadvantage when it comes to discussing race, because we still are the most segregated, really, communities. If you collectively look at across racial and ethnic lines, yeah, there are Christians across the spectrum, but do we worship together? We don't. And I realize that this probably evokes a lot of I don't know. I'll just go ahead and make the comparison. Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Does anybody here, folks, know who Dietrich Bonhoeffer is? Good. Yeah. How was it that when he was in Germany in 1932 that he could see what was going on with even before Hitler came into power with the German church? How is it that he could see the red flags, that there was all this nationalism, that there was all this anti-Semitism? It was because he worshipped in a black church in Harlem for a year. He was at Union Seminary, and he was very much aware of the racial situation, and he had friends. It wasn't just a table conversation that he had with seminarians. He was in that community. He taught Sunday school at Abyssinian Baptist Church. He had good friends that he maintained friendship with. And so he was able to see that and name that sin in Germany, in a way that hardly anybody else, any other German theologians would do. And I really think that's the case here. If we're not going to worship together, if we're not going to fellowship together, how is it that we're going to be able to speak to truth to power? I think we're in a position of weakness.
A couple of things. You say about 12 things that need 15 million answers. Couple of things. One is from the cultural standpoint. When we're all being adults and being very open and honest, right? Within the regards of the black church, when you have a culture or an environment, especially down south, where grown men are called boy, and black women are taking care of white women's families, the church was the only place you could be somebody. And so you'll find a lot of black churches are structured because they provided empowerment. So to go into a white church a lot of times would mean that you would give up that power, or that role, that title that gave you some influence. Let's talk about this whole integration thing. The fight really was not